Everybody, so let's continue this afternoon with the gender session of this Going Extreme Arenas International Conference. I'm very glad to have here Sara Farris that will talk about the normalization of Femonationalism in Europe. Sara Farris is reader in sociology at Goldsmith University of London. Her work focuses on migration, gender, and political economy of care and social reproduction, and especially the role that migrants and racialized workers play within economies of care and social reproduction, the financialization and corporatization of care, and the racialization of sexism. Between her works, well, obviously I name In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femonationalism of 2017, where finally Sara coined this concept that we'll explain also today in the conference. But also other books, 2013, Max Weber, Theory of Personality, Individuation, Politics and Orientalism in the Sociology of Religion. And as an editor with Beverly Skeggs, Alberto Toscano, and Svenja Bromberg, the Sage Handbook of Marxism, where she wrote the chapter about gender.
And social reproduction.
And social reproduction, exactly. And finally, also, I want to point out a research project that she developed in the last years, Corporate Care in London, the corporatization of care, homes, and childcare in the UK capital. And meanwhile, they start Sara and other Francesca Scarinzi, Susie Meret, and other researcher an Horizon Europe project that is called You Dare, Youth Debunking the Gendered Argument of Far-Right Extremism. That is very linked to Arena's project and what we are talking here today. So the floor is yours, Sara, and normalization of femonationalism in Europe.
Thank you very much. So first of all, really thank you for having me here. I'm very honored that you invited me to, to talk about, everything is falling apart, sorry. All right, so thank you. And I really want to thank all the organizers because I know how much work there is behind organizing such a conference. So I really want to tell the name. Stephen, of course, I've been in touch especially with him, but also Ricardo Martinez, Miguel Angel, Sergi, and Pere. I apologize if I am pronouncing their names badly and incorrectly, but really thank you. And thanks not just obviously for inviting me, but for organizing this conference. That's been extremely interesting for me so far. So what I want to do, I prepared some slides that they can't see at the moment, but you will see hopefully them soon. What do we do, Miguel, to see the slides? Some magic, some energy. Anyway, while we wait for the tech to fix this, I prepared some slides that I would like to show to you because I think images in the context of the far right and studies of the far right and gender are very important because they have worked a lot through images. Maybe the thing I will say briefly as we wait is that the project that Stephen mentioned at the end is the project on the gendered patterns within the youth organizations, far-right youth organizations. We haven't started yet. We were just awarded the grant we just discovered a couple of months ago. We are going to start in 3 months in 2025. But we are quite excited, as you can imagine, because we think that one of the perhaps things that's been missing or that should be studied more in these studies on the far right and gender specifically is the role of the youth, but also how gender travels in a way. How is it conceptualized amongst the youth? What kind of role also youth organizations and the youth in general have in creating new forms of leadership, but also the role of gender in the also affective socialization to politics and to far-right politics. I think this is an issue that I think will be very important to understand. So this is the cover of my book, of the Spanish translation of the book. It was published, I think, translated, so 3 years ago. And I was telling Stephen and others yesterday that it's interesting for me that especially recently, the book has been around for a while in Spain now, but it's especially recently, I would say in the last 2 months, 2-3 months more or less, that I keep receiving emails and requests for interviews by journalists in El País or other Spanish outlet. And I kept wondering what's going on in Spain, why everyone is now asking me to say something about Femonationalism in Spain, which is not the context of my research, by the way. I'm not an expert on Femonationalism in Spain. But so in a way today, I will also be very interested in hearing from you about what is actually going on in Spain and why you might think this could be an interesting concept and framework to think with when it comes to the relationship between the far right and gender. So as Stephen already said, I introduced this concept in 2017. The original English version was published in 2017. And it had quite for me, obviously, I'm very happy about this, quite an international reception. The book has been translated already in 7 languages. And you can see some of the covers, the French edition, the Italian edition, and the Slovenian one alongside the Spanish one. So obviously, there is something, right, going on. It speaks to different contexts and different countries. Obviously, the translations is something that makes me happy. At the same time, I find alarming that obviously in all these different countries, the far right is mobilizing gender in such a strong way, and the fact that this speaks to such a different context. So just to say, this concept, femonationalism, some of you might be wondering, where does it come from? I was very inspired in the 2000s by the work of Jasbir Puar, who is a queer scholar, who in 2007 published a book on homonationalism. And in that book specifically, Jasbir Puar was analyzing what she called the collusions between sections of the LGBTQ movement and American nationalism. And more specifically, she was looking at the ways in which Muslims were increasingly framed as homophobic, and how some LGBTQ movements were actually, buying into this idea of the Muslim man in particular, or Muslim communities more generally, as being homophobic. So this concept, I thought, was extremely powerful and important. It was capturing something important that was happening to the to nationalist movement. But I really wanted to focus on the ways in which these parties mobilize gender and feminism, but also the ways in which some feminists are, I don't want to say colluding, but just let me use the Jasbir Puar language for a second, colluding with some of these nationalist movements. I mean, some of them are colluding, some of them are not. And I will try to tell you why this story of the feminist involvement in femonationalism is a little bit more complicated. And so just to give you a little bit of background about my research, Italy, I'm Italian. Italy really was my, it was really what prompted my research was really seeing this poster. I mean, what I mean is I am a scholar of migration and gender. And for many years, I studied mainly 2 things, really. economic location of migrant women, and so what do they do in the labor market, but also the cultural representation of migrant women, especially in Europe, in Italy, but also in France and in the Netherlands. And so when I saw this poster, this is probably from 2006, if I remember correctly, so it's a quite old one. But for me, what was very interesting is that a anti-feminist party such as the League in Italy was using this type of language, right? Speaking to women, saying, they're clearly saying, if you allow Turkey to enter the European Union, we risk that our women will end up behind bars, just like Muslim women. So there was a very strong instrumentalization in this case of gender themes in order to carry out a right-wing anti-Islam campaign. And so I began to really try to understand more what was going on in this phenomenon. And so I just want to show you some examples. This is not, I told you already, Spain was not one of my case studies, but I just put it here because I know it could be interesting for you. This is Rocío Monasterio from Vox. I'm sure she's familiar to you. And quite recently, I believe it was maybe a couple of years ago, she started again basically claiming that there is an incompatibility between Muslims and women's rights. So in this case, for example, she says, she's an architect, as you probably know, and she says, when I am on the work site and I tell my workers, do this and do that, she says it's only the Muslim workers that actually look at me as if it's strange they're taking orders from a woman. And one wonders, how do you know they're Muslim? But anyway, this is another story. But you understand the message, right? It's very clearly linking anti-Islam as incompatible with gender rights. The clear example is Marine Le Pen. She's made so many declarations basically saying migrants are a threat to women's rights. You know, I mean, we can choose so many. So this is just to say, I studied specifically the case of France, Front National, when it was still Front National, Italy, the Northern League, or League, and the Netherlands, the Party for Freedom of Geert Wilders. So these were my 3 case studies. And I looked specifically through content analysis of their electoral campaigns, their websites, or their political documents and programs more generally. I looked specifically at the ways in which they mobilize women's rights. And in the majority of cases, in the 99% of cases, is always in the context of anti-immigration campaigns and anti-Islam campaigns. So this is to say, they don't have any credentials or any specific interest in gender issues, but is really specifically in the context of bashing immigrants that they talk about women's rights. And so the concept of femonationalism really is this, is the attempt at making sense, providing a succinct, if you like, concept, in fact, to describe this very strange constellation of actors. So I will read it for you, and then I will say also more specifically what this constellation is constituted of. So femonationalism is short for feminist and femocratic nationalism. It refers both to the exploitation of feminist themes by nationalists and neoliberals in anti-Islam and anti-immigration campaigns, and to the participation of certain feminists and the femocrats, and I will explain what that means, in the stigmatization of Muslim men under the banner of gender equality. Femonationalism thus describes, on the one hand, the attempts of Western European right-wing parties and neoliberals to advance xenophobic and racist politics through the touting of gender equality, while on the other hand, it captures the involvement of various well-known and quite visible feminists and femocrats in the current framing of Islam as a quintessentially misogynistic religion and culture. So with this concept, I try to capture both what I described, which is the ways right-wing, traditionally anti-feminist parties mobilize gender equality, but also the ways in which some feminists have also entered into anti-Islam campaigns in the name of women's rights. And as I said, the feminists in this case, it's a little bit of a more complicated story than in the case of the far-right parties. But what interests me is also the ways in which neoliberal policymakers, specifically in the context of implementing new immigration and integration policies from 2005 onwards, have also increasingly adopted this language of Islam, even if they don't say that explicitly. But very implicitly, the idea is Islam in particular and migrants from the global south in general are misogynistic. They need to be taught about women's rights because they fundamentally come from backward countries in which they don't know what it means to respect women. This is the kind of underlying text of many of these new integration and immigration policies, and as I will try to explain. So I think what I want to say about this concept, there are two things that also from a methodological point of view are quite important for me in this book. One is the concept of convergence, and one is the political economy of femonationalism. So let me try to speak a little bit about this, and I will try to make it not too academic, even though it's a little bit of a methodological academic discussion. So as I was saying, these entanglements between right-wing parties and feminist ideas that they mobilize in very hypocritical and instrumental ways really dates back to 9/11 in so many ways. Just think of the ways in which the bombing of Afghanistan, I mean, many of you are too young really to remember this, but the bombing on Afghanistan was really justified among other things, but one prominent theme was we need to save these Muslim women. Really the idea that the West was, the war on terror was also made in the name of women in order to save women from Islam became an incredibly strong theme all throughout the 2000s. Now, in Europe, from the 2001 onwards, we see how this theme is very strongly adopted by all these far-right parties. We see Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands. Marine Le Pen begins a little bit later to do that as well, and other parties, like the Northern League, as I showed already in 2005, 2006, starts using this idea of women as in danger when it comes to Islam. So because of that, there has been quite an international debate on these issues. So I'm not the first one to discover these entanglements. This is to say, there is a very interesting debate. Scholars in France, for example, I'm thinking of Eric Fassen, started to work about sexual nationalism. Other scholars, remember Lise Fekete, for example, in the UK, started talking about enlightened fundamentalism. So different definitions have been given about what was going on. Jasbir Puar talks of homonationalism, looking specifically at the mobilization of gay rights. So this is to say, there is an international debate. It's been there for quite some time. And in much of this debate, there are many different concepts that have been mobilized. So for Puar, as I said, it was a collusion between sections of the LGBTQ movement and American nationalists. Other scholars talk of instrumentalization. Women have been instrumentalized. Ideas of women's rights have been instrumentalized. Some scholars talk of co-optation. So I found myself, especially when I was analyzing the documents and the work of feminists, what they said, how some of these feminists contributed to these debates, I found myself increasingly uneasy with all these concepts. And one of the reasons that, for example, I don't find the concept of instrumentalization of feminism, of feminists particularly useful, is partly that some feminists are very, very aware of what they are doing. They know exactly that by adopting a certain anti-Islam lexicon, they are, in fact, encouraging certain forms of Islamophobia in society. And I will speak a little bit more about that. But also, I think more generally, I was very inspired by the work of Derek Bell, who is an African-American scholar, who introduced this notion of, he spoke of interest convergence theory. So Derek Bell, this has nothing to do specifically with this theme. Derek Bell speaks of interest convergence theory in the context of the end of segregation in the United States. And so he looks at different cases in which, for example, the American courts uphold the end of segregation in school, racial segregation, and he claims the reason they did that was not because these American politicians have been they have suddenly converted to anti-racism, and now they are battling also for civic rights. It's simply because they understood this in their interests in this specific historical conjuncture to do that. So I thought actually it was much more interesting also considering the different actors I was juggling with. I think the concept of convergence tells us something much more interesting here, a much more complex story, but I think also a more precise story. And so with this concept, what I try to say is that some of these actors are really converging, sometimes unintentionally, on a specific political space, which is the one in which Islam, specifically in this conjuncture, is defined as an enemy. And they are doing that. Some, they are very clear what their interests are, and these are specifically right-wing nationalists. They have everything to gain from the mobilization of feminist themes in these completely hypocritical ways within anti-immigration campaigns. My claim is that instead feminists, they might think they are doing it in the interests of women, but in fact, they are completely running against the interests of women by doing that. And there are very concrete examples here. And one of the things that I think is very important to understand is that when feminists start to buy into the argument according to which Islam is the quintessential enemy of women's rights, what happens is that the other forms of sexism and gendered violence that we have in society, that obviously with which migrants and Muslim men have nothing to do, not only become less and less pertinent, but we start with a discourse of racialization of sexism, what Francesca Scrinzi, for example, talks a lot in her latest book, which is the ways in which in these countries we see increasingly an association of sexism with ethnic minorities and racialized groups. This is not just rhetoric. I think it's very important to understand. There are concrete policies and laws that are very dangerous and that are connected to this idea that the dangerous men are mainly the immigrants or the Arab men. And so to give you an example, in France, just a few years ago, there was a huge debate about the new street harassment law that was actually approved not by a far-right politician, it was a Schiappa. And in that context, if you look at, there are studies that have been done on this, but if you look at the ways in which there's a street harassment policies have been presented, the idea was, who are the harassers? The harassers are mainly migrants or those who live in the banlieue, those who live in the outskirts of the big cities. So again, a big association between sexism and gender harassment and migration. This is a fundamental problem, to think that the main problem is men. Statistically, simply is not true. As we know, gender violence occurs in all social classes, in all type of contexts, and in fact, more often than not is related to relatives, people that the women know personally and intimately. But the problem was also another one, that by buying into this argument according to which it is especially migrant women and Muslim women who need to be saved from gender violence, or that the enemy is especially migrant men, what happened also is that many for example, anti-violence programs began to be shut down. In the Netherlands, this was very clear. they started to say, you Dutch women, you don't need this funding to fight gender violence. You are liberated. You are completely fine. We now need to concentrate this money and this funding on the migrant women, on the ethnic minority women, because they are the ones that need to be emancipated and they experience sexism, et cetera, et cetera. So this is to say that I believe that this idea of convergence really helps us to understand that there are very clear interests in place, and that these interests sometimes work in different ways for the different actors who converge on this space. The other thing that I think the concept of convergence highlights is the ideological matrices of these very different actors. Let me spend a couple of words on this. So I think it's also important to recognize that these actors are converging because there are ideological matrices that enable them to have this convergence. So they are buying into some general political principles that actually allow them to meet on this specific space. In the case of right-wing nationalists, it is clearly nationalism. The only thing I would say here is that I prefer the concept of nationalism to that of populism. A lot of, as you know, there is a lot of research on this, on, the populist radical right became a very important concept in this field of studies, or these parties were called populists. I don't want to talk too much about this because it will take me too long, but this is just to say that I think nationalism is a much better concept to understand what is going on. Also because there are a lot of studies, for instance, from post-colonial feminists that already 50 years ago began writing about the connection between nationalism and gender, looking at how, for instance, colonialism, so nationalism or imperialism, was very much putting forward these ideas of the women in the colonies, so the women in the global south as victims, and the men instead as sexual threats. So in many ways, some of these ideas are not new at all, but they really go back to colonial times in many ways. The ideological matrix of the feminists, very different constellation here, both right-wing and left-wing, who actually meet at these convergence points of Femonationalism. I would say it is Westocentrism. That's why I say some of these women actually, they are traditionally, they consider themselves left-wing. Some are absolutely right-wing, but some of them consider themselves left-wing. And here it is really the battle on the veil that has become really the pivotal point. And it's really that moment at which you have seen in different countries, in France in particular, is probably the most well-known case at least, and the one that I know better, but also in Italy and in the Netherlands, we have seen many well-known feminists, traditionally considered left-wing, engaging in anti-Islam and especially anti-veil battles. Now, again, we could speak a lot about this, but I think that what brings together these more left-wing feminists and the right-wing feminists, both to say Islam is a quintessentially misogynist religion, and the Muslim veil is a problem, is a symbol of oppression. Muslim women need to be saved, emancipated, etc., etc. Both left-wing and right-wing feminists have been saying that, right? I think they fundamentally share a form of Westocentrism, according to which Western gender relations in the West are more advanced, and therefore they need to be safeguarded. Some of them would say that more explicitly, some of them more implicitly. But I am sure that you are familiar with the argument. I've been asked many times, what about women in Iran? What about Saudi Arabia? What about, so don't you think that gender relations and conditions are better in Europe rather than in these countries? I'm not going to speak more about this, but because I'm sure it's going to be perhaps an interesting point of debate, I will leave it for later, otherwise I speak too much. All right, let me go to the political economy. because actually this is my central argument in many ways. I speak much more about political economy in the book than I speak about convergence. So why the political economy? So remember I said I'm really entering into an international debate. There have been many studies that have looked into the ways in which these right-wing parties are mobilizing feminist themes. What, especially in the European studies, from 2005, 2006 onwards, many of these studies rightly concentrated on the civic integration programs. And these civic integration programs, I believe in Spain you have a version of this. Basically, they are programs that have been implemented all across the European Union from 2005 onwards. And the idea was, the push was very much from the Netherlands. And so in a way, civic integration programs in other countries replicated a version of these programs that had been already implemented in the Netherlands. But in a nutshell, these programs basically ask that migrants can demonstrate that they can speak the language of the country and they know the history and the values of the country in order to obtain either nationality or a long-term visa. What's also interesting but scary is that in many cases, these civic integration programs ask migrants actually to be integrated before they arrive in the country of destination. So for example, countries like France and the Netherlands, they ask migrants wanting to go to the Netherlands or wanting to go to France to first pass a test of language proficiency already in their country of origin, okay? So if they don't pass the test, they will not be allowed to come to the country. So there is this very strong demand within these programs that migrants are somewhat familiarized with these cultures and with European languages and cultures. So what became interesting for many scholars in these years is that if you look at the lexicon, but also the materials that these civic integration programs use, it became very clear that gender equality was very prominent. So in many of these countries, migrants are basically told, so they have to study certain materials, right? And I did it just a few days ago, just to give you an example, because I'm trying to have a British nationality. And in Britain, there is a version of civic integration. And so what I had to do, maybe if I give you this example, it becomes a little bit clearer. I had to study a little booklet about the history of the United Kingdom, the values, civic life, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, it was quite funny because I knew many of the ideological, undertext that I was reading. But in all of these documents, there was this constant reference to gender equality, especially in the civic parts. There were things like, in the United Kingdom, forcing your wife to have a sexual intercourse is not tolerated. Or women can open a bank account just like men, things that you find a little bit odd in this context. But the clear message is we are countries that champion gender equality, equality between women and men, and so you should know about this. And obviously, the assumption of these programs is that migrants don't know anything about gender equality, right? That they need to be taught by Europeans about gender equality. This became, in the 2000s, I remember, became particularly even comic in a way. In the Netherlands, for example, they were showing migrants these videos of women, topless women that were sunbathing topless on the beach. And so the idea was, you see, Dutch women are so liberated, you have to accept that that's what they do. Or they were showing men with aprons to say, men here also cook and stay in the kitchen. So it became really comic and ridiculous. But it is very true, and I can say now from experience, I did a test in which quite several questions were about, we have gender equality laws in this country. So a lot of scholarship really focused on these more cultural elements, right? Or how migrants in these civic integration programs were, the idea of gender equality was increasingly emphasized and presented as a fundamental European value that migrants have to learn. But what I wanted to know, especially after the global financial crisis of 2007, 2011, the language of civic integration began to change again. And you might remember there were also harsher laws and discourses on controlling the borders. There is a lot of unemployment in Europe, so we have to be careful to have more migrants, et cetera, et cetera. So in this context, actually, one thing that's been overlooked is the way in which economic integration also became much more prominent. So it was no longer just about learning that women can open a bank account. It was also, these civic integration programs were also asking, particularly women, but all migrants really, to demonstrate that they were trying to integrate economically. So how did they could demonstrate that? Different countries have different laws, but for example, in France, what they did, and I believe they're still doing, is they ask the migrant to come to a meeting with a special officer. They go or they do their CV, and they have to demonstrate that they are actively looking for a job. So economic integration really became central. Migrants had to be economically useful to the country in order to show that they wanted to integrate. This was particularly strong for women. And the idea really was a lot of migrant women are unemployed, which is true. There is a higher rate of unemployment amongst the migrant women compared to migrant men. But they claimed in these documents that somewhat implicitly and somewhat explicitly that the reasons why these women were unemployed was sometimes maybe they came from cultures that didn't valorize women's employment, or maybe they were not used to they were more used to the idea that women have to stay at home, all things that are absolutely incorrect. I mean, we can talk again a lot about statistics about migrant women, their previous work experiences, studies degrees, et cetera. But in any case, because of this strong emphasis on migrant women are more unemployed than migrant men, these economic integration policies started to target especially migrant women. And they did this in the following way. So in 2009, if I am correct, the European Union established the so-called European Integration Fund. There was a pot of money that was available to the member states of the European Union, to all those organizations that could demonstrate that they were doing some activities in order to help migrants to integrate. And there was a specific pot of money left for the economic integration of migrant women. It was actually general integration, but with a special eye at economic integration. So what I did, because I really wanted to understand, okay, what are they doing to integrate these migrant women? What are these organizations in France, Netherlands, and Italy actually trying to do in order to help these women navigate their new lives in these countries? And so what I did was I analyzed the projects that had been awarded between 2009 and 2014. And if you look at this project, what was very interesting for me is that I would say 2/3 of the projects, the ones on economic integration specifically, they were all basically channeling migrant women, sorry, I wanted to use this one, in one sector of the economy. And I'll tell you in a second. So this is one example from France's Promo Femme. This is quite a well-known organization, women's organization in France. It's based in Bordeaux, specifically the one I analyzed. They received funding from the European Union through this special fund in Bordeaux. And when you look at what they do for migrant women, they help them find work in domestic work, care, labor, caring for elderly people, caring for children, cleaning hotel rooms, etc. The same goes for Italy. This comes from an organization called Nosotras, which was founded initially by a group of Latin American and Italian women already back in the late 1990s. But so it's a great organization, and so is Promofam. But what is interesting is that, again, this is from a report that they did to say this is what we did with the money from the European Union. This is how we helped migrant women to find a job. And as she says, this is one of the women who works for Nosotras and who worked in this project. She says, what I did for this project, I accompanied migrant women into their job interview. So she was helping with answering questions, translations, etc. And she says, in almost all cases, it is for work, for care and domestic work. For me, this is absolutely key, is what I call really the political economic foundation of all these discourses about wanting to save migrant women, applying a double standard to migrant women rather than migrant men. Maybe I didn't emphasize these two questions that are really the leading questions for me in the book, which is really why are la batteria, se sta something, why are Muslim women being presented with offers of emancipation and rescue in a context of rising Islamophobia and anti-immigration sentiment? So why are these anti-immigration parties or these feminists willing to emancipate and to save migrant women, but they are not so willing in the case of migrant men, right? Women seem to be somehow those that can be rescued, that can be tolerated, but the same doesn't apply to men. And really, for me, the key question is why there is this double standard when it comes to migrant women and migrant men. So the women are the victims, and instead the men are the perpetrators. And don't you think, and this is also an open question for you, that there is something about the way in which migrant women, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, are perceived? They're not really perceived as a danger, especially in the economic realm. When we think about migration as an economic threat, in the large majority of cases, I would even say that all of cases, it is about migrant men. When you see representations of migration and migrants as economic threat, what you have in mind and what these far-right organizations have in mind very clearly is men. They're saying it is migrant men that are stealing jobs for our men. It's never women. And the reason is precisely this, because these women are absolutely necessary in the care economies. And this, for me, is really the political economic foundation of Femonationalism. I will give you this example, which for me is paramount. So it is not just something that I think because they do that implicitly. This became very explicitly with Roberto Maroni, who this is something he said in 2009 when he was Ministry of Interior in the Berlusconi government. He was the leader of the League. And so it was in the context of a mass regularization. You know, in Italy, usually there are, it's probably similar to Spain in some ways. Usually irregular migrants are regularized every 30 years, depending upon the political climate, the demand of labor markets, etc. So in that year, remember, was the midst of the global financial crisis. And so these parties were really rallying on the slogan that migrants steal jobs. We don't need any more migrants because we already have so many Italians who are unemployed, etc., etc. But in that context, when they had to regularize some 100,000 some migrants, which was the highest number of regularization there was in Italy for years, Roberto Maroni had to justify it, right? Because he was asked, you keep talking against immigration, but then you are regularizing all these migrants, so what's going on? And he says, you know, there cannot be a regularization for those who entered illegally, for those who rape a woman or rob a villa, as if, you know, migrants just do that. But certainly, we will take into account all those situations that have a strong social impact, as in the case of migrant caregivers. I think it couldn't be clearer than this. So the idea is very clearly, these women, we can apply a double standard to migrant men and migrant women, Muslim men and Muslim women, because these women are not dangerous, they are not an economic threat. On the contrary, we badly need them in the care economies, because they are the ones looking after elderly people in the context of an aging population. They're looking after children. They are cleaning the houses of the middle-class families, especially that vote for these parties. And a long discussion could be opened about this, etc. But so really my conclusion here is that the double standard that is applied to Muslim and non-Western migrant men in the public imaginary as individuals that in need of special attention or rescue really is an ideological tool that is connected to the key role of these women in the reproduction of the, what I would say, the material conditions of social reproduction or care. So we need to understand the Femonationalism as part and parcel of the specifically neoliberal reorganization of welfare, labor, and state immigration policies that have occurred in the context of the global financial crisis, and more generally, the Western crisis of care or crisis of social reproduction. Now, I really thought, I finished my research in 2015. I'm really going towards a conclusion. I just want to show you in what ways I think there has been a normalization of Femonationalism, as the title says. So I finished my research in 2015. The book, as I said, was published in 2017, and then there have been these various translations, etc., that seem to me to testify that clearly there is this phenomenon quite evidently going on also in other countries. But when I say there has been a sort of normalization, I think what I mean is a little bit what Stephen said this morning about there has been a certain normalization of the discourse of the far right. So this idea that women's rights and migration, and especially migration from Muslim-majority countries, are incompatible, has gained an incredible momentum. It's like now used as if it's normal, as if it's speaking, to kind of the common sense of people. And I want to give you some examples here. So in Italy, before she was elected as you know, the first female prime minister of the country, Giorgia Meloni, this was very famous. She used a clear Femonationalist trope. She published a video, she posted, a video, I believe it was on Twitter probably or something, in which, here, I'll just translate from the Italian. She says, we cannot be silent in front of these atrocious act of sexual violence against a Ukrainian woman that's been perpetrated by an asylum seeker. A hug to this woman. I will do everything I can in order to make our cities safe, okay? So she was very much criticized because she posted the video showing this rape, obviously problematic for so many reasons. But the point is, she's clearly using the idea, you see asylum seekers, migrants, they are a threat to the safety of our city and to the safety of women. More recently, Bardella did a whole video again during the election campaign, appealing to women. And this is just a little excerpt that I blocked on YouTube. You can find this video on YouTube. And he's speaking, to French women and saying, with me you will be safe, and you will be free to dress the way you want. So he's also speaking to Muslim women. And the idea is, they are not safe, They are forced to wear the veil, apparently. And therefore, he's, again, mobilizing this idea, gender equality and Islam are incompatible. France is a very interesting case, also because in the last couple of years, there is this new phenomenon of these right-wing, or I should say far-right feminist collectives. A famous one is Nemesis. I hope I pronounce it correctly. And this is a group of very young women who they became famous during the Zemmour campaign because they somewhat were in favor of, they were supporting his candidacy. And they are the ones also that in many ways, I don't want to say inspired, but they were became well known in France in the context of the anti-street harassment policies, because mainly their campaigns revolve around the idea we don't feel safe because there are too many migrants in our cities and they harass us on the streets. And so here, for example, they say, foreign rapers out, free us from immigration. And obviously, this is an example that I'm sure I think you spoke about this yesterday, and I know it's quite, it's been quite in the press in Spain. So, as I said, I'm not an expert on the Spanish case. It was not one of my case studies. So I do not know whether the Popular Party used this trope in the past. But my understanding is that this is also something a little bit new, that he's, in a way, using the rhetoric of Vox, and particularly the idea that he wants to defend women and homosexuals from migrants. It's something new. My take is that he's trying to take back votes that went to Vox, so he's trying to occupy that political space more on the right. And obviously it's interesting that he does that by resorting to the language of women and gay rights. So really my very last slide to say that I think gender is clearly a key battlefield. It's become a really important political battlefield for the future. And here I have some suggestions for a research agenda, because I think we still have a lot to understand and to research. For me, it's interesting. I don't know how much you spoke about this in Spain, but in France, in Italy, in the UK, it was very clear also in the case of the beginning of the conflict in Israel, how much this idea that Hamas raped women, Israeli women, was used so strongly in order to justify the genocidal violence that Israel then unleashed. And really for months, it was not possible to talk about anything else or to accuse Israel of atrocities because Hamas had raped these women. And of course, you can see how much also the stereotype of the Arab man and the Muslim man as violent, played into that. Obviously, the anti-gender mobilizations, I think it's really important to understand also the links, because if you think about it, the far right is using gender in very ambivalent ways. On the one hand, they endorse, obviously very hypocritically, as I said, and very instrumentally, ideas of gender equality, but on the other hand, they are absolutely on the anti-gender part of the battle. They are, again, not everywhere, but I think it would be interesting to understand more about these ambivalences, and again, to understand why this gender is such a battlefield. And I think the focus on masculinity and youth, I think when it comes to gender, especially studying the far right, we really need to understand masculinities. Gender is not women. Gender is obviously the whole spectrum, and I think in this case we need to understand a little bit more what's going on to men, young men, for instance. So really, just to conclude, sorry, this actually is a repetition of the last slide, because I wanted to show you this image by Barbara Krugen, that this poster became very famous years ago, Your Body is a Battleground, and she plays with this image of the man, of the woman, who on the other side, it's not clear, maybe is a man. And to say that this is going to be also a little bit the focus of our project, You There, which is going to focus precisely on the youth and the mobilization and the role of gender in the political socialization of the youth. Thanks very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, really, Sara. We have some minutes to question and some comments. So, Alex, then we can start with you. Then, yeah, you there.
Okay, thanks for the talk. Real food for thought, really. Sorry, just one question. You could explain. I was thinking about the class component of all this, and you mentioned that obviously when you talk about the political economy of femonationalism and the way it operates. But I was wondering whether in the actual representation of Muslim men, there is as well an issue of class that is somehow implicit, because well, as you perfectly know, recently Mohammed Al-Fayed has been accused of a number of sexual abuses with his staff. And to the best of my knowledge, no one ever mentioned that he came from a Muslim country or that. So obviously there is a class component. A rich man, it doesn't matter. And I was wondering whether that is something that you've come across in your research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the micro.
First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And I have two very quick questions on when would you place the start of this new trend of mainstreaming of femonationalism? Also, would you place the start of this trend first in certain of your case studies and then in others? I mean, are there differences in terms of country? Thank you.
I don't know if there is some more question. If not, yeah, the floor is yours. Yeah, there's another question here. If you want, we can take also this.
It's better so I can also hear from you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very inspiring talk. I was wondering the extent to which this tendency that you have described is due to the rise of the neoliberal feminism, and how this, dialogue with the book of Rothenberg, about this phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. Yes, the issue of class, I think it's definitely very prominent. It's completely implicit, as class always is, because no one really wants to talk about it, apparently. But I think it is. I think it is prominent. The majority are poor men, and they are poor men, working class. They are employed in working class jobs, and that's why in the book I also say that this rhetoric really, in this specific historical conjuncture, really from the, I would say, early 2000 onwards, uses Muslim communities and Muslim men as the quintessential example, but it's not just about Muslims. It is really about migrants, poor migrants from the global south. And you have many examples from this, for this. So again, I was looking back at the ways in which, in Italy, for example, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there were many migrants from Eastern Europe. And in those years, it was also quite common that migrant men from Eastern Europe were represented as a sexual threat. The idea was that these men were particularly involved in sexual trafficking, and again, the women were victims of sexual trafficking. And as someone who I did my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees studying immigration in Italy, female immigration in Italy, I remember reading a lot of books in which the idea was constantly that migrant women were migrating from tradition to modernity, that So this is just to say that the issue of class is very prominent, and it's prominent precisely because it's not applying just to Muslim men, but it's really across the board of immigrants. When does it start? I mean, as I said, some of these ideas are quite old, and some of them really, as I write in the book, there are strong colonial legacies. As you can see that colonial powers, I would say in all the different contexts, really tended to portray the women as victims and the men in particular, or at least as those who could be domesticated, and the men instead as always, a sexual threat, or in any case, those that cannot be domesticated so easily. So in that sense, there is a certain, modularity of Femonationalism. And you see that these ideas also were present in the past. There are obviously, specificities in the present, and in that sense, I would say it starts really from, I would say 9/11 is in many ways the beginning of these contemporary forms of Femonationalism. Differences between these countries, yes, absolutely. So to give you just one little example, in the Netherlands, Femonationalism went hand in hand with homonationalism. So the Party for Freedom was claiming to be defending women's rights, but also LGBTQ rights. In France, instead, Marine Le Pen was, obviously, as you know, the Front National was never a party, pro-gay rights. But Marine Le Pen actually started to open to the homosexuals' rights. One of her main counselors years ago was an openly gay man. In Italy, on the other hand, homonationalism is inexistent in my view, because these parties are very strongly homophobic. So there is the defense of women's rights, but not the defense of gay rights, unless there have been more recent developments of which I'm not aware, but it seems to me that there is a dividing line on the issue of gay rights, LGBTQ rights. And the question on the rise of neoliberal feminism, this is a very interesting and I don't know how to answer this. I think it's a very complicated issue in the sense that maybe, I will need to think about this, but I would say that maybe one of the things that the work of Rothenberg, for example, of neoliberal feminism shows is that these new forms of even right-wing, liberal or neoliberal feminism are really demonstrating there is a plurality of feminisms and feminist demands. And in that sense, I think we also need to acknowledge that there is a growing constellation of new feminism forming, taking shape on the right wing of the spectrum. And I say this because I remember at the beginning when I started to work on this book and to present some of this work, I was always told, yeah, but these women you are talking about who say these things, they are not feminists. And, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true because on the one hand, it is true that since, I would say probably since the 1960s, with the second wave of the feminist movement, we have tended to associate feminism with an emancipatory and progressive movement. That is very true. But at the same time, feminism is not innocent. There are many instances, historically, as a movement, there have been instances of entanglements between feminism and strong forms of nationalism and imperialism. There are many examples in France or in the United Kingdom where the women's organizations in France, and I am aware of the French and the UK cases, the suffragette in the 1920s, they clearly said in their political documents, you cannot give the right to vote to Indian men before you give it to us. Because, come on, we are white. we are British and white, and these men are inferior to us. So there was a clear racist register, a clear imperial colonial register that some of these feminist movement were using. So this is to say, feminism is plural. There are different articulations. Obviously, I consider myself a feminist, and of a specific kind. So I hope that the type of feminism that I advocate, which is anti-racist and anti-capitalist and anti-colonial, can be majoritarian, but I also have to recognize that these different neoliberal right-wing feminists are there, and they are becoming quite vocal.
Well, it's really, really, really interesting. I think we should have like a break, because in 10 minutes we should start the other round table. But in any case, we continue to talk about gender. Yeah. So I think we have the time there to go deep in some of these issues. So in 10 minutes we will have here Paolo Gusmeroli, Claudia Jareño, Isidora Grubacki, and Gwenelle Beauvoir, and then Ana Yara Postigo Fuentes to Extremist narrative, and gender roundtable. So have a break, 10 minutes. Thank you.